Johannesburg
Your
summit.
Excellency, we should not allow anything to diminish the value, the stature, and the impact of the first African G20 presidency. This G20 Leader Summit has a responsibility not to allow the integrity and the credibility of the G20 to be weakened.
There are moments in global politics when a single image sums up the entire story. At the G20 summit in Johannesburg, the first ever hosted on African soil, that image wasn't a handshake or a speech. It was an empty chair. The seat reserved for the United States, the next country set to lead the G20, stood vacant from start to finish. No president, no senior delegation, just silence in a room full of leaders. And that absence became louder than anything said on stage. Most people expected the US to dominate the narrative. Instead, it became the biggest gap in the room. What followed wasn't chaos. It was Africa stepping forward with a level of confidence and clarity that even seasoned diplomats found surprising. The world moved on without Washington, and that single missing chair raised a bigger question. What happens when global leadership simply doesn't show up?
The world expected tension at this year's G20 summit, but no one, not analysts, not journalists, not even the diplomats behind the scenes, expected a complete power reversal. For the first time in modern geopolitical history, the United States walked into a G20 meeting prepared to dominate the conversation, and left the room overshadowed, not by China, not by Europe, not by Russia, but by South Africa. And for former U.S. President Donald Trump, the moment was more than embarrassing. It was a public dismissal, a political humiliation, the clearest sign yet that the global order is shifting rapidly, and that America's once unquestioned authority is no longer guaranteed. For years, African nations, especially South Africa, had pushed for more influence in global decision-making, and for years, they were politely acknowledged, then ignored. This year, South Africa arrived with a very different strategy. Its delegates were armed with unprecedented leverage, strengthened BRICS alliance and new investment, partnerships with Asia and the Middle East, a booming energy and minerals sector sought by every major economy, and a diplomatic network more coordinated than ever. South Africa wasn't here to participate. It was here to lead. And that leadership would soon collide with Trump's agenda. Privately, several G20 members had grown exhausted with Trump's unpredictability and confrontational style. Diplomats whispered that this summit, unlike previous years, would not orbit around U.S. demands. Yet, Trump's team arrived expecting the opposite, expecting to dictate trade terms, expecting to pressure energy-rich nations, expecting to challenge China publicly, and aggressively expecting to confront African nations about mineral access and supply chains. Stage was set for a clash, but Trump did not anticipate that South Africa, not the United States, had already secured the alliances necessary to flip the discussions in its favor. Seated at the center of the table, traditionally a position of high influence, was not a U.S. representative, but South Africa's delegation. Trump reportedly paused, visibly irritated, as cameras flashed. His aides scrambled to understand what had happened. It was later revealed that several G20 members had requested South Africa chair key sessions related to global energy transition, critical minerals, geopolitical security, intrusion, debt restructuring, climate and infrastructure, financing. In every category, South Africa was now considered a bridge nation, capable of negotiating between developing countries and major powers. The U.S. had underestimated how much global trust South Africa had earned. A high-level negotiation on global commodity access, initially planned for the United States to lead, was abruptly reorganized. South Africa took the lead. China and India supported it. The EU followed. Even Saudi Arabia signaled approval. Trump's delegation protested, but the decision was final. Inside the room, when Trump attempted to insert himself into the discussion, Multiple delegates reportedly steered the conversation away, returning to South African proposals without acknowledging Trump's objections. It was a diplomatic cold shoulder, and everyone noticed. South Africa sets agenda at G20. US plays catch-up. Emerging powers unite behind Africa's leadership. Trump's influence shrinks as South Africa rises. Trump, frustrated, walked out of a meeting early, a moment caught on camera, replayed millions of times. Originally a loose economic partnership, BRICS had evolved into a geopolitical counterweight to the G7. South Africa, as its most politically agile member, had become a gateway between Africa and Asia, developing nations and energy exporters, commodity rich African states, and industrial power houses at the G20. BRICS members strategically aligned behind South Africa's proposals, creating a voting bloc too large for the U.S. to override. Trump, who had long accused BRICS of trying to undermine American influence, found himself outnumbered in nearly every major session. The global balance had shifted, and for the first time, Africa was at the center of that shift. Why did the world suddenly pay so much attention to South Africa? The answer is simple. Resources. South Africa controls or influences access to platinum, lithium, rare earth element, uranium, and some of the world's most strategic shipping routes. These are the minerals that power electric vehicles, smartphones, energy, nuclear reactors, military technology. U.S. had grown increasingly dependent on African minerals. And South Africa chose the G20 to announce a new policy. Africa will no longer sell raw minerals without industrial participation. Foreign companies must refine and process minerals inside Africa. This shook the entire Western economic model. Trump strongly opposed the policy, but dozens of nations publicly supported it. South Africa had outmaneuvered the U.S. with a single statement, and the world applauded. Within hours, the summit had become a global media storm. CNN, South Africa takes unexpected leadership role. BBC, G20 sees emerging power realignment. All, J0, Africa speaks, and the world listens. South African media, historic moment as SA dominates G20 agenda. U.S. outlets, Trump marginalized at summit. Commentators argued that this was a humiliation, a wake-up call, turning point, beginning of Africa's recessive decline of U.S. unilateralism. Social media exploded with footage of Trump sitting silently as African and Asian leaders drove the conversations. The narrative was no longer in America's control. South Africa delivered a bold, structured proposal, a new model for global trade that demanded fair terms for developing nations, reform of outdated trade systems, respect for African sovereignty, transparent commodity pricing, industrial investment instead of resource extraction. It was revolutionary. Trump attempted to counter with an alternative U.S. plan, but the rumor quietly, politely, returned to South Africa's version. The final G20 communique incorporated nearly 70% of South Africa's proposals for the United States. This was not just a diplomatic defeat. It was a warning. Some called the summit a global embarrassment. Others blamed Trump for alienating allies. Others argued that the U.S. was losing its influence to rising powers, especially African nations. News cycles ran with the story for days. Why did South Africa overshadow the U.S.? Is this the end of American dominance? Is Africa the future superpower? What does this mean for global leadership? Trump himself released statements claiming bias, unfair treatment, and political conspiracy, but privately, even U.S. officials admitted South Africa had played the game perfectly. There are moments in history when power visibly shifts, moments when the old guard loses momentum and the new guard steps forward. The 2025 G20 summit was one of those moments. South Africa proved that a developing nation can lead the world. Africa cannot be ignored. The United States no longer controls the agenda. BRICS is a real counterbalance of miners and resources now influence global politics more than ever. And Trump, once one of the most dominant political figures on earth, learned that the world had changed without him. This was the summit that shocked the world, the summit that sidelined a former U.S. president, and the summit that revealed the growing power of a continent once underestimated. South Africa didn't just participate in the G20. It rewrote it.